It began, as some of the darker mornings of my life have begun, with a sound that refused to belong to the hour. The bell of St. Frideswide's, distant yet insistent, drew itself through the half-fog like a question no one wanted to answer. I had been awake already, of course. An unfinished crossword and a half-cold whiskey marking the close of a night that had promised thought and yielded only memory. Outside, Oxford was still half asleep, the cobbles wet with the modest ambitions of the rain. The Oxford Mail lay folded by the armchair, its ink smudged by carelessness or guilt. I can't now recall which. It was Lewis who had underlined the brief column with a biro, the neat blue line cutting through the calm prose of the report. Clergyman found dead before morning service. Chapel at St. Frideswide's College sealed pending investigation. I'd looked at it once, decided against caring, and then looked again. That small act of repetition that has undone me more times than I care to count. It was not the death itself that pricked me, nor even the setting. Oxford breeds such occurrences with depressing regularity, but the sentence that followed. A hymn book was open, though the service had yet to begin. There was something in that, something unearned, unfinished. I found myself staring at the words long after the paper had ceased to matter. By the time Lewis arrived, all boots and practicality, I had convinced myself that curiosity was a form of obligation. We drove through the drizzle in a silence that owed more to familiarity than restraint. He remarked, eventually, that it seemed a straightforward affair. Heart failure, perhaps. I said that hearts rarely fail without reason, and that priests, of all people, seldom die tidily. St. Frideswide's greeted us with the damp smell of stone and hymn books. A small college, forgotten by ambition but beloved by those who feared change. The porter, a man with the expression of a long-suffering saint, led us toward the chapel where the body had been found. The bell rope hung motionless now, a frayed cord still shivering from its morning duty. The verger spoke quietly, as though the dead could be roused by gossip. Canon Lionel Fenton, he said, a man of principle and habit. Arrived early each day for Matins, unlocked the chapel himself, always lit a single candle before prayer. Only this time the candle had burned lower than expected, and the hymn book beside him had been turned to lead kindly light. I remember thinking that it was a choice too sentimental for Fenton, who had been known more for doctrine than tenderness. There was the faintest trace of tobacco in the air. Not strong enough to belong to anyone who smoked regularly, but distinct enough to linger. Lewis noticed it too. The verger insisted that no one in the college use the vestry for smoking. I nodded and said very little, which is often the surest way of making people talk. We left the chapel by the north door, the one that opened onto the cloister. Rain had begun again, discreet and apologetic. Lewis muttered about how the colleges were all the same. Too much money, too little sense. I told him that money and faith had always kept peculiar company, and that sanctity was rarely improved by polish. Before leaving, I glanced once more at the stall where the canon had knelt. The candle had been replaced, the hymn book closed, the scene restored to a decorum it no longer deserved. Yet the image persisted, the quiet figure, the open page, the faint smell of something that had no right to be there. Later, back in my flat, I tried again at the crossword. 7 down, light of the world. 5 letters. I wrote looks, paused, and stopped before completing it. Some clues, I thought, are better left unsolved until the bells begin again. I've never liked the smell of chapels at midday. Morning's chill evaporates, and what remains is the faintly sour perfume of polish and age, as if sanctity itself had gone slightly stale. St. Frideswide's was no exception. Its pews gleamed, its brass candlesticks caught the pale light obediently, and somewhere behind the organ pipes, a draught whispered with the insistence of an old confession. Lewis walked a few steps ahead, always with that policeman's gait. Half military, half mistrustful. He had asked the obvious question as we entered. Why would a man preparing to pray unlock a door that was already open? I told him it was a question worth keeping unanswered for a while. The truth of people often lies in what they take for granted. The chaplain greeted us near the chancel, a tall, stooped figure, his hands stained with the black residue of candle wicks. He spoke softly, his words shaped by the habit of reading aloud in empty spaces. The canon, he said, had been an early riser all his life. Punctual, solitary, particular. He used the word devout as though testing whether it still carried meaning. I asked when he had last spoken to the man. Late the previous evening, apparently, about the next morning's readings. A discussion of Corinthians, of temptation. I remember how his eyes shifted at that last word, as if it had weight. While Lewis asked his dutiful questions about locks and keys, I let my attention drift toward the choir stalls. They were arranged neatly, hymn books stacked with monastic care. Yet one seat, the second from the left, nearest the altar rail, bore a small irregularity, a patch of darker polish, freshly applied. Someone had scrubbed at something. The chaplain followed my gaze and smiled that unconvincing clerical smile which hides more than it forgives. He said the verger had been cleaning since dawn. I murmured that zeal is a fine thing, provided it leaves the evidence intact. The organist arrived shortly after, a pale young man with the distracted expression of one who lives chiefly in notation. He was the college's organ scholar, Julian Thorne. His handshake was cool, his smile delayed. He assured us the canon had been in good spirits the previous night. Rehearsal had ended by 9, he said. He had locked the vestry himself, but his eyes, restless and bright, flicked once toward the instrument as though something unsaid lingered in the pipes. I asked if he had played that morning before the service. He shook his head too quickly. The organ, he explained, required tuning. The top F had gone flat again. He made it sound like an inconvenience, but his words carried the faint tremor of guilt. It is curious how lies reveal themselves not in content, but in rhythm, that hurried need to end a sentence before it incriminates. When the questioning was done, Lewis and I stepped out into the cloister. Rain tapped at the flagstones, small deliberate fingers. He thought the chaplain nervous, the scholar worse. I said both were true but unhelpful. Everyone near a corpse grows nervous. It's the living we should worry about. We paused beneath the bell tower, and I took from my pocket the canon's sermon notes handed to me earlier by the chaplain. A single line was underlined twice. "Deliver us from the subtle snares of the virtuous." It was not scripture, but something borrowed, perhaps an echo from a poet. I could not recall which. But it struck me that Fenton, who prided himself on orthodoxy, had chosen to emphasize precisely the danger he embodied. As we left, the choir began to rehearse, their voices trembling through the rain like ghosts who still believed in redemption. I remember Lewis remarking that the sound was beautiful. I thought otherwise. To me, it was already a lament, for the canon, for truth, and perhaps for the comfort of faith that dies long before the body follows. That afternoon, as we drove back toward the station, the faint smell of tobacco still clung to my coat. I rolled down the window, hoping the wind might strip it away, but some sense, like certain sins, are stubborn things. I've never liked the smell of chapels at midday. Morning's chill evaporates, and what remains is the faintly sour perfume of polish and age, as if sanctity itself had gone slightly stale. St. Fridwide's was no exception. Its pews gleamed, its brass candlesticks caught the pale light obediently, and somewhere behind the organ pipes a draught whispered with the insistence of an old confession. Lewis walked a few steps ahead, always with that policeman's gait, half military, half mistrustful. He had asked the obvious question as we entered. Why would a man preparing to pray unlock a door that was already open? I told him it was a question worth keeping unanswered for a while. The truth of people often lies in what they take for granted. The chaplain greeted us near the chancel. A tall, stooped figure, his hands stained with the black residue of candle wicks. He spoke softly, his words shaped by the habit of reading aloud in empty spaces. The canon, he said, had been an early riser all his life. Punctual, solitary, particular. He used the word devout as though testing whether it still carried meaning. I asked when he had last spoken to the man. Late the previous evening, apparently, about the next morning's readings, a discussion of Corinthians, of temptation. I remember how his eyes shifted at that last word, as if it had weight. While Lewis asked his dutiful questions about locks and keys, I let my attention drift toward the choir stalls. They were arranged neatly, hymn books stacked with monastic care. Yet one seat, the second from the left, nearest the altar rail, bore a small irregularity, a patch of darker polish, freshly applied. Someone had scrubbed at something. The chaplain followed my gaze and smiled that unconvincing clerical smile which hides more than it forgives. He said the verger had been cleaning since dawn. I murmured that zeal is a fine thing, provided it leaves the evidence intact. The organist arrived shortly after, a pale young man with the distracted expression of one who lives chiefly in notation. He was the college's organ scholar, Julian Thorne. His handshake was cool, his smile delayed. He assured us the canon had been in good spirits the previous night. Rehearsal had ended by 9, he said. He had locked the vestry himself. But his eyes, restless and bright, flicked once toward the instrument as though something unsaid lingered in the pipes. I asked if he had played that morning before the service. He shook his head, too quickly. The organ, he explained, required tuning. The top F had gone flat again. He made it sound like an inconvenience, but his words carried the faint tremor of guilt. It is curious how lies reveal themselves not in content, but in rhythm, that hurried need to end a sentence before it incriminates. When the questioning was done, Lewis and I stepped out into the cloister. Rain tapped at the flagstones, small, deliberate fingers. He thought the chaplain nervous, the scholar worse. I said both were true, but unhelpful. Everyone near a corpse grows nervous. It's the living we should worry about. We paused beneath the bell tower, and I took from my pocket the canon's sermon notes handed to me earlier by the chaplain. A single line was underlined twice. "Deliver us from the subtle snares of the virtuous." It was not scripture, but something borrowed, perhaps an echo from a poet. I could not recall which, but it struck me that Fenton, who prided himself on orthodoxy, had chosen to emphasize precisely the danger he embodied. As we left, the choir began to rehearse, their voices trembling through the rain like ghosts who still believed in redemption. I remember Lewis remarking that the sound was beautiful. I thought otherwise. To me it was already a lament. For the canon, for truth, and perhaps for the comfort of faith that dies long before the body follows. That afternoon, as we drove back toward the station, the faint smell of tobacco still clung to my coat. I rolled down the window, hoping the wind might strip it away. But some scents, like certain sins, are stubborn things. The first thing I noticed about Julian Thorne was how carefully he moved. Each gesture seemed measured, as if conducted to some silent metronome only he could hear. His face was pale. Not the pallor of illness, but of someone who had spent too long indoors with sheet music for company. The kind of youth Oxford manufactures effortlessly. Clever, self-regarding, already a little ruined by admiration. We met in the practice room adjoining the chapel. The air smelt of varnish, candle grease, and something faintly chemical. Metal polish, perhaps. The organ loomed above us like an accusation, its stops gleaming dully in the weak afternoon light. Julian sat at the bench, fingers resting lightly on the keys. I remember how his nails were neatly kept but faintly ink-stained, as if he had been writing too many letters or too many apologies. Lewis began with the routine questions. What time he had last seen Canon Fenton, whether the canon had seemed unwell, if anyone had entered the chapel late that night. Julian answered each one with an odd mixture of courtesy and fatigue. He said he had left around 9 after practice, that the canon had been reading from the lectern, and that all was perfectly ordinary. It was the last phrase that caught me. The ordinary always conceals the exception. When Lewis turned to examine the organ pipes, I lingered by the music stand. A score of Lead Kindly Light lay open, annotated in a thin, slanted hand. Among the musical markings was a faint smudge of blue-black ink, the same hue I'd seen on the cuff of Julian's shirt earlier that day, and, I recalled, on the envelope in Mrs. Fenton's study. Coincidence, perhaps? Oxford thrives on them. He caught me looking and smiled a little too easily. Said he'd been composing something of his own. A canticle, he called it, a meditation on forgiveness. The word hung in the air like a dissonant note, unresolved. I asked if the canon had approved. He said the canon had been interested. It was a curious choice. Not pleased, not encouraging, but interested. The kind of interest that implies disapproval softened by intellectual curiosity. I remember the small silence that followed. Julian began to play, softly, tentatively, a few bars of the hymn. The sound filled the narrow room, rich and hollow at once. There is something about organ music that makes deceit almost noble. When he finished, he looked at me with that curious mixture of defiance and appeal I've seen in too many young men, as if daring me to understand what he could not say aloud. I asked, lightly, whether he ever smoked. He laughed. Of course not. His lungs were his livelihood. Yet I saw his eyes shift for a fraction of a second toward the narrow window ledge, where a single match lay, burnt to the stem. It was an unnecessary lie, and unnecessary lies are rarely innocent. When we left, Lewis muttered, something about students and their vanities. I said vanity was rarely fatal, but even as I spoke, I knew it could be, not by its presence, but by its betrayal. The boy's hands trembled when he closed the score. Fear, perhaps, or guilt, or the sudden realization that truth is a performance one can't sustain indefinitely. That evening, I sat by the window of my flat with a glass of whiskey and the day's crossword. 5 down, voice that conceals truth, 7 letters. I wrote music, then hesitated. Too obvious, too easy. I erased it and left the space blank. Outside, the bells of St. Fridwide's began their low rehearsal for evensong, and somewhere in that sound I thought I heard a discord, faint but persistent. A note struck not by faith, but by regret. The next morning I found myself wondering not about who had killed the canon, but who had silenced him, and whether the difference mattered. Morning light never flatters old stone. It creeps in uncertainly, flattening color and turning every shadow into something faintly accusatory. That morning, the chapel at St. Fridwide's looked less like a house of prayer than a room holding its breath. The scent of wax and damp hymn books clung to the air. The candle smoke seemed reluctant to leave. Lewis was already waiting for me in the second pew, his expression a mixture of boredom and mild resentment. He's always been more comfortable with facts than atmospheres. The verger had found something, he said. A folded piece of paper beneath the cushion of the canon's stall. A note. The word carried more weight than it should have. I took the small square from Lewis and opened it slowly. The handwriting was neat but hurried, the kind that comes from restraint breaking into confession. 6 words only. The truth will not be sung. Lewis thought it some student prank. I thought otherwise. There was a rhythm in that phrase, the deliberate inversion, the implied silence. Not a joke, but a message from someone who understood how words can hide what they reveal. I sat in the stall itself, letting the wood creak under me, and tried to picture Fenton there that last morning. The open hymn book, the candle, the page turned to lead kindly light. It was all so composed, so precise. And yet this note, hidden, desperate, broke that symmetry. Why conceal such a thing in a place consecrated to harmony? Unless, of course, the harmony itself was false. Lewis wandered off to question the verger again, leaving me alone with the echo of my own thoughts. The organ pipes loomed above like sentinels of some silent theology. Dust drifted through a narrow beam of light. I noticed then a faint mark on the wood just beside the seat. A pale ring where something circular had once rested. A cup, perhaps, or a glass. The canon, as far as anyone knew, never drank in the chapel, but someone had. I took out my notebook and scribbled a word. Anomaly. Beneath it, a question mark. It has always been my preferred method, to write down uncertainty and wait for meaning to form around it. Lewis returned, reporting nothing of value. The verger insisted the stall had been untouched since the morning of the death. I asked whether the choir had used this seating the night before. They had. Rehearsal until late, apparently. The organ scholar conducting, the chaplain present for part of it. And the canon? No. He had excused himself early. It struck me then that absence in Oxford is often more revealing than presence. People here vanish from rooms long before their bodies leave. When we stepped back into the quadrangle, the air was heavy with drizzle. A delivery boy pedaled past, his bicycle bell cutting through the grey. Lewis asked what I made of the note. I told him it meant that truth had a melody once, and that someone had chosen to silence it. He frowned, as he often does when metaphor takes the place of logic. That afternoon I took the note to my office and laid it beneath the desk lamp. The ink was black, not blue, and faintly glossy where the strokes thickened. Fountain pen, not ballpoint. The same kind, I remembered, that had written the widow's letter. The same disciplined hand, perhaps, disguised by haste. On my way home, the bells began again, their tone strangely uneven, as if the clapper struck out of sync. I stopped at the gate and listened until the sound dissolved into rain. A man once told me that Oxford's bells have perfect pitch. He was wrong. They're only human, after all, prone to hesitation, capable of deceit. That night I poured myself a drink and opened the crossword. 4 down. Unspoken truth. 6 letters. I wrote silent, hesitated, then changed it to secret. It fit better, though neither answer felt entirely right. The master of St. Friedeswide's had a garden that looked as though it had been planned by someone who mistrusted nature but adored its illusion. Paths of immaculate gravel, roses disciplined by wire, every blade of grass clipped into propriety. I remember thinking it was an appropriate setting for conversation about sin. Tidy, fragrant, and quietly ruthless. He greeted Lewis and me with a measured courtesy that concealed fatigue. I had met him before, years earlier, when he had still believed scholarship could defend against decay. Now his eyes carried the resignation of a man who had discovered otherwise. We walked slowly among the borders, the rain having ceased but the ground still glistening as though reluctant to dry. He spoke of Canon Fenton without sentiment. A sound man, perhaps too certain of his soundness. His opposition to the scholarship fund had made him unpopular, but unpopularity was an old companion in Oxford. When I asked why, the master hesitated. Something about moral principle, he said. Fenton felt the bursary encouraged dependency. A curious argument, I thought, from a man whose own salary had been drawn from endowment and inheritance. The name that emerged, inevitably, was Julian Thorne. The canon had tried to prevent his appointment as organ scholar on grounds of character rather than talent. The master phrased it delicately. Impropriety of a personal kind. Rumour, nothing proven. But in Oxford, rumour is often simply evidence wearing a mask. We stopped beneath the yew archway, where the air smelt of damp leaves and something older. I noticed a scattering of cigarette butts among the roots, fresh, pale against the soil. The master did not smoke, nor, officially, did the chaplain. I made a note of it, though I pretended only to admire the roses. The smallest lie in such settings is usually the one that reveals the most. As we turned back toward the cloister, he mentioned that the canon's widow had been in contact the previous week about her husband's declining health. Headaches, sleeplessness, anxiety. I asked if he'd advised medical attention. He had not. Clergy, he said, prefer to treat despair with prayer. It was meant as irony, but his voice carried a trace of regret. Lewis, impatient as ever with nuance, asked whether he believed in the possibility of suicide. The master paused, long enough to make the word itself seem vulgar. No, he said finally. Fenton's vanity was too robust for that. I caught the faintest smile then, the kind one uses to disguise complicity. Before leaving, I asked about the chapel keys. The master claimed no knowledge beyond what we already knew. The verger's set, the canon's personal copy. Yet his eyes flickered when I mentioned a third, supposedly missing, once assigned to the organ scholar for after-hours practice. He denied it, but the denial arrived too smoothly. People who lie well forget that truth rarely travels with such confidence. That evening, I returned alone. The college was silent, save for the rain resuming its quiet catechism on the cobbles. The master's windows glowed faintly behind curtains drawn too early. I walked again past the garden, and there it was, that unmistakable scent of tobacco, faint but distinct, drifting from the yew arch. Someone had been there since our visit. I stooped to examine the gravel where the butts had been. The newest ash was still intact, unscattered by wind. A thin line of mud led toward the back entrance of the master's lodge. Narrow footprints, fine-soled, almost delicate. Not the shoes of a gardener. Lewis would have dismissed it as nothing, but I have learned that the smallest marks, a footprint, a smudge, a silence, are the only reliable truths left to us. I wrote the word trace in my notebook and underlined it twice. Back in my flat, I poured myself a drink and unfolded the day's crossword. 8 down. Seeds of corruption, 7 letters. I stared at the grid until the answer came unbidden. Gardens. I left it blank all the same. Some clues I've found are best unsolved until the rain stops. It was the kind of afternoon Oxford keeps for its secrets. A dim, pewter sky. The bells silent, the streets emptied of conviction. Lewis had gone off to fetch the car from the station yard, leaving me outside St. Fridswide's with nothing but the sound of the rain finding the drains. That was when I saw her, a girl no more than 19, standing by the cloister gate, her choir robe gathered awkwardly about her, as though she wished to vanish inside it. She said she needed to talk. Her voice carried that brittle composure of the devout. Obedience turned almost into fear. We found refuge in the anteroom by the vestry, where the smell of damp hymnals clung to the air and the electric heater buzzed like a guilty conscience. I offered her a seat. She refused it, of course. The young always prefer confession to be theatrical. She told me she had seen something the night before Canon Fenton's death. A quarrel in the cloister, 2 figures half hidden in the mist. One had been the canon, his voice unmistakable even through anger. The other, a man in a dark choir robe. I asked if she recognized him. She hesitated, her gaze wandering toward the rain-streaked window. The sound of the organ drifted faintly from the chapel, practicing perhaps, or mourning. She said she believed it was the organ scholar, Julian Thorne. But then, almost immediately, she denied it. She said she might have been mistaken. People hear what they expect to hear, she added, a phrase that did not belong to her vocabulary. It was then I noticed the bruise at her wrist, a small crescent as though made by the edge of a ring. She tucked her hand beneath the folds of her robe when she realized my glance. I asked gently whether she and Julian were close. She blushed, though not with shame, more the embarrassment of someone caught halfway between denial and memory. Lewis returned, dripping wet, and handed me the umbrella he'd forgotten earlier. The girl thanked us, her tone rehearsed, and slipped back toward the cloister. I watched her go. Her steps echoed against the flagstones like the faintest percussion in a requiem. Later, over lunch at the Trout, Lewis declared she was protecting someone. I said perhaps she was protecting herself. He frowned at that, as he often did when morality became elastic. Yet something in her phrasing had lodged itself in my mind. People hear what they expect to hear. It was a line I'd read once in an essay on acoustics and deception. The Canon had quoted it during one of his sermons. I remembered it now, word for word. So who had she been listening to all this time? Back at the station, I went through the Canon's sermon notes again. Amid the pages of theological repetition, one margin held a single annotation: "Lead kindly light, alter order." The handwriting was his, but faint, hurried. Alter order. Was it a musical instruction or a confession of another sort? I thought of the organ scholar, his trembling hands, his ink-stained cuff, and of the girl, her bruise, her fear of being right. The line between music and deceit is thinner than one imagines. That night I returned alone to the chapel. The air had cooled, the candles guttered. I took my seat where the girl had once sung, the same place from which she claimed to have seen the quarrel. Through the rain-blurred glass, the cloister lay empty, but I could almost see it. Two figures, one pleading, one turning away. I do not know how long I sat there. The bell struck 6, and the sound spread across the courtyard like a wound reopening. In that moment, I understood something small but certain. The truth in this case would not be shouted from the pulpit, nor played upon the organ, but whispered by those who had already sung too much. The morning began with rain again, thin, persistent, and without rhythm. Oxford in the rain has a way of disguising everything. The stone loses its dignity, the spires dissolve into mist, and gilt becomes just another shade of dampness. I sat in my office, staring at the autopsy report Lewis had left on my desk and wondering, not for the first time, how truth could sound so much like dissonance. A mild sedative had been found in Canon Fenton's blood. Not enough to kill, not even enough to alarm. A sleeping draught, most likely. Something to hush the noise of thought before dawn. Lewis, practical as ever, believed it proof that someone had tampered with his evening drink. I was less certain. There are poisons more subtle than medicine. Some are administered by words or by absence. We returned to St. Fridswide's just after noon. The chapel was empty, its air dry with the faint sweetness of polish and incense. Julian Thorne was there, though, seated at the organ, his back to us, playing a piece I didn't recognize. It was delicate but oddly fragmented, as though he'd forgotten where one phrase ended and the next began. When he noticed us, his hands fell from the keys with an abruptness that told me he'd rather we hadn't heard. Lewis asked him about the sedative. Julian blinked as if the word itself were an accusation. He said he knew nothing about it. The Canon had suffered from nerves, he added. Everyone knew that. I asked if he had ever seen him take anything before Matins. He said perhaps, once, a tonic. His gaze drifted toward the window as he spoke, to where the rain gathered in uncertain rivulets against the leaded glass. There was something almost tender in his voice, a grief unacknowledged. When he left, I sat at the organ myself, striking a few tentative notes. The sound filled the chapel with that peculiar fullness only an empty room can give. Then I played the hymn the canon had chosen. Led kindly light. Its melody, so modest in its piety, seemed suddenly less a prayer than a plea. And in that instant I heard it. One note in the refrain slightly altered, barely perceptible, but enough to jar the symmetry. A mistake or something more deliberate. Lewis dismissed it as coincidence. I told him harmony is a fragile thing. Once disturbed, it rarely restores itself. The canon had annotated his sermon with the same hymn. Perhaps he'd noticed the alteration. Perhaps that was why he'd underlined the words, "So long thy power hath blessed me." Or perhaps he hadn't noticed at all, which would have been the greater tragedy. We walked through the cloister to the vestry. The rain had stopped by then, but the smell of wet stone lingered. I paused where the choir girl had claimed to see the quarrel. The angle of vision was wrong. She could not have seen faces from here, only outlines, gestures. Memory, I thought, always adjusts its own lighting. Back in my flat that evening, I poured a small measure of whiskey and spread the canon's sermon pages across the table. A droplet of ink had bled through the margin beside the line, "In death's uncharted night." It looked, absurdly, like a note on a stave, and when I compared its placement to the altered note in the hymn, the symmetry returned. Not accidental, not careless. Someone had changed both, as though to echo the same hidden message in word and sound. I didn't yet know what it meant, but I knew the pattern. Guilt in Oxford often hides behind intellect, wrapped in metaphor, disguised as art. The canon had died amid music that no longer obeyed its own logic, and somewhere between those two melodies, his and Julian Thorne's, a truth waited, quiet and off-key, to be heard. I left the pages where they were and turned out the light. The faint hum of the city reached through the rain-spattered window, not harmony, not dissonance, just the long, patient note of something unresolved. The chapel library was the quietest room in Oxford, not by rule, but by reverence. Dust hung there like old theology, suspended between faith and forgetting. It was late afternoon when I entered, the kind of hour when the city's spires began to look less eternal and more exhausted. Lewis trailed behind me, muttering about drafts and the smell of old bindings. He never liked libraries. "Too many ghosts," he once said. I told him that was precisely why they were useful. We had come because of a name, or rather, the absence of one. Among the canon's papers, I'd found a reference to a volume of psalms long out of print. Its presence in the college archives was pure chance. Its owner's inscription was not. The librarian, a fragile woman with the nervous precision of a metronome, led us to the glass case where it rested. Psalms and Meditations, printed 1874. She unlocked it with a key that looked older than the book itself. I lifted the cover with care. On the first page, faded ink announced a dedication, "Lux mea peccatum," my light, my sin. The words had been written twice, the first in a fine hand, the second overwritten, heavier, darker, as though someone had wished to reclaim them from erasure. Beneath it, the canon's initials. The alteration was crude, the line of a man who could no longer trust his own neatness. Lewis asked if I recognized the phrase. I told him it was not scripture, but a distortion, borrowed from a 19th century poem by an obscure cleric who had been accused of plagiarism and moral turpitude in equal measure. Fenton had quoted the same man in his final sermon notes. It was not piety he admired then, but irony. The librarian excused herself, leaving us in that peculiar stillness libraries know, a silence dense enough to carry meaning. I turned a few pages and found something else. A pressed flower, flattened into ghosthood. A white rose petal, brittle as ash. I remembered the same scent from the canon's funeral wreath, arranged by his widow. Coincidence, perhaps, but Oxford rarely deals in coincidence. Lewis thought I was reaching. He said people keep mementos without malice. I said they also keep them with it. The rose, the overwritten dedication, both belonged to a conversation the canon had never finished. I ran a thumb along the page's edge and felt a roughness beneath the print, something hidden between sheets. With care, I loosened the binding enough to draw out a folded scrap. It was a note, written in the same delicate hand I'd seen before, the widow's. The ink was paler, aged by guilt. Forgive what was never meant to be known. Nothing else. No name, no date. Only that line. Lewis exhaled as though the library had grown colder. I slipped the paper back where I'd found it. Some truths are better left bound. Still, the words clung to me like smoke. Forgive what was never meant to be known. It was confession, not apology. A difference I've come to understand too late in life. We stepped out into the quadrangle. The rain had ceased, leaving the stones slick and gleaming under a bruised sky. Students crossed hurriedly, their laughter faint, like a hymn remembered wrongly. Lewis asked what it meant. I told him it meant nothing, which, of course, meant everything. That night at home, I poured myself another whiskey and unfolded the crossword. 11 across. Hidden message. 10 letters. I stared at it for a long time, pencil hovering until the answer surfaced from somewhere half-lit. Dedication. I filled it in and closed the paper. Outside, the bells began again, their echoes passing over the rooftops like a benediction denied. I sat by the window until the sound dissolved into silence, thinking of the canon, the rose, and the line he'd tried so hard to overwrite. We all crave illumination, I suppose. Even those of us who know that light exposes more than it redeems. There are moments when a sound, once familiar, returns altered, emptied of comfort, heavy with recollection. The bells of St. Friedeswide's had always struck that delicate balance between devotion and melancholy, but that morning they seemed to falter, like a choir unsure of its own faith. I had returned to the chapel alone. Lewis had gone to interview someone or other. I no longer recall who. What mattered was not people, but sound, the faint thread of music that had been weaving through the case from the start. I sat in the canon's stall, the same one where they had found him, and opened the hymn book that had lain beside his body. Its leather was still faintly creased where a hand had once rested, the pages smelling faintly of candle smoke and human worry. I turned to lead kindly light, as if repetition might yield revelation. Yet the melody, when I hummed it softly to myself, felt wrong, not because of its sentimentality, but because of something hidden in its pattern. Music, like guilt, has its own logic. The canon had marked the hymn with small pencil strokes, faint, deliberate, 3 beside the first verse, 2 near the refrain. A code, perhaps, or a sequence of numbers that might have meant nothing to anyone but him. I fetched the order of service from the lectern, the one prepared for that ill-fated morning, and noticed something I had missed before. The hymn numbers, when aligned with the pencil marks, formed a progression. 338, 421, 95, 95, 421. A repetition that could not be accidental. It was Lewis who had once said I saw patterns where there were only coincidences. Perhaps he was right. Yet I have learned that truth prefers disguise. It hides not in the chaos of the world, but in its repetitions. I took the canon's notes from my coat pocket and began to align the numbers against the words he had underlined in his sermon. Light, sin, mercy, Anna. Anna, the widow's middle name. I had not realized it before, or perhaps I had and had chosen not to. I sat back, letting the words settle into the silence like a stone breaking still water. The Matins motif, I thought, a pattern of devotion and deceit disguised as worship. The canon had built his own requiem, written in pencil and hypocrisy. I walked to the organ and lifted the cover. Its keys were cool, smooth, faintly sticky from years of use. When I pressed the first note of the hymn, the sound trembled through the pipes like something reluctant to emerge. The melody formed itself under my fingers, halting, tentative. Yet the discord remained, a single wrong note in the refrain. Not a mistake, but intention. Someone had altered it. The motif, when written as letters, A-N-A, the same repeated triad, the same as her name, too neat for accident. I played it again, slower this time. Each sound fell into the next with dreadful inevitability, as if the truth itself had been rehearsed too many times. Outside, the rain began again, tapping against the stained glass like an impatient witness. I thought of the canon, slumped in his stall, his hymn book open to a song about guidance through darkness. And I thought of Anna Fenton, her fingers steady around the decanter, her eyes too calm when I mentioned the time of death. Lewis would later call it intuition. He dislikes the word deduction, too clinical for the sort of knowing that arrives by sorrow rather than reason. But standing there as the final chord faded into silence, I felt the case had already confessed itself, not through evidence, but through echo. I closed the organ lid and left the chapel without ceremony. Behind me, the bells began again, uncertain and weary, as if the college itself were praying for forgetfulness. I remember thinking that harmony, like innocence, is never restored, only imitated. It was nearly dusk when I returned to Jericho Terrace. The lamps along the canal were flickering into life, their reflections trembling across the water like thoughts half-remembered. I had called ahead, though she had not answered. I suspected she knew why I was coming, and that silence, for her, was a kind of acceptance. Anna Fenton opened the door before I could knock. The house looked smaller than I remembered, or perhaps I'd grown too weary to see it properly. She led me inside without a word. The air was thick with the scent of lilies, the kind that bruise easily. On the piano lay a single glass, half full, beside the decanter I had seen on my first visit. The needle of the gramophone had found its groove and was turning idly, whispering a faint, unending hiss, like a secret that had already been told. She sat where the light touched her hair and said quietly that she'd expected me. People always know when truth is approaching. It carries its own weather. I asked her about the sedative. She smiled, not unkindly. Lionel had always needed something to quiet his thoughts, she said. He feared his dreams, though he called them prayers. She had slipped something into his glass that night, just a few drops to still the noise of his voice. She had not known it would still his heart. Her hands trembled only once, when she poured herself a measure of sherry and placed the decanter back with the precision of habit. I asked if she had written the letter I'd found in the psalm book. She nodded. Forgive what was never meant to be known. The words were hers, she said, though she had written them for no one in particular. They were for herself, a confession without priest or absolution. There was a long pause then, filled by the faint sound of a clock ticking somewhere beyond the hallway. I remember thinking that Oxford's tragedies were rarely crimes of passion. They were crimes of weariness, of intellect turned inward until it devoured itself. She spoke again, softer now. Lionel had once told her that faith was the only way to silence desire. But desire, she said, has a longer memory than God. Lewis would have wanted me to arrest her. Procedure would have required it. Yet there was no malice in her story, only exhaustion. She had not meant to kill him, merely to buy herself a single night of quiet, a small reprieve from a life conducted in the shadow of sanctity. When I asked if she regretted it, she looked toward the window where the evening had turned to glass. Regret, she said, is simply another form of worship. I left her there, seated at the piano. She began to play. Not lead kindly light, but something older, slower. A melody that wavered at the edge of memory. It might have been Bach, or it might have been her own invention. Either way, it was beautiful in the way all endings are. Fragile, necessary, undeserved. Outside, the rain began again. Soft, reluctant. I walked back along the canal, past the shuttered shops and the faint glow of a pub I didn't enter. My coat was soaked through, but I felt oddly clean, as if absolution might sometimes come through silence rather than confession. Later, at home, I poured myself a whiskey and unfolded the day's crossword. 10 down. Act of mercy. 7 letters. I thought for a long time before writing pardon. Then, after a moment's hesitation, I crossed it out and left the space blank. Some clues, I have learned, are not meant to be solved, only lived with. The rain kept falling against the window, rhythmic, persistent. Somewhere in the city, the bells began again, not in triumph, but in resignation. And in that dim, patient sound, I heard her melody still. The widow's final recital, fading gently into prayer. It has been some years now. Yet every time I hear the bells of St. Friedeweids, I think of that morning after the case was closed, or rather, after it simply stopped. Cases seldom end, you see. They fade, like candle smoke in old stone, leaving only a smell that never quite disperses. The college had resumed its rituals. Students hurried across the quad, the choir sang, the organ repaired its wounded harmony. Oxford restores itself with unnerving ease. Death, even scandal, becomes merely a footnote in the city's unending essay on continuity. Lewis had written his report, precise and untroubled, and filed it away among the other solved mysteries that weren't solved at all. I remember standing at the gate of the chapel that morning. The bell tolled softly. Not the solemn, measured sound of mourning, but something gentler, as though uncertain whether it was calling the living or the dead. The rain had stopped, leaving the air sharpened and clean. A group of students passed by, laughing, and one of them, a young woman with a book clutched against her chest, glanced at me briefly. Her eyes were pale grey, almost colourless, and for an instant I thought of Anna Fenton. Then the moment was gone. I went inside. The chapel was empty except for the verger arranging flowers at the altar. White roses again. He greeted me without surprise. "They are from Mrs. Fenton," he said, "for the Canon's memorial." He spoke without judgment, though the words carried more than they meant. I thanked him and sat in the back pew. The air smelled of polish, lilies, and faintly of tobacco, that same ghost of scent that had lingered from the first day. Some things, it seems, refuse to be absolved. I stayed for the better part of an hour. The choir began to rehearse, the same hymn as before. Lead kindly. Light. The organ, newly tuned, found its perfect balance again, though one note, that altered refrain, still caught my ear. A minor key where a major should have been. It was as if the music itself remembered what had happened, refusing forgiveness. Outside, I saw Lewis waiting by the car. He looked restless, tugging at his collar. He said he'd been thinking about her. Mrs. Fenton asked whether I thought she would ever tell the truth. I said she already had, though not in words. Lewis frowned, as he often did when my answers were built more of feeling than fact. But I think he understood, eventually. Some confessions are audible only to those prepared to listen for silence. We drove back toward the city center in companionable quiet. The streets were damp, the river high. A bicycle bell rang somewhere behind us, faint but insistent. And I felt that odd tightening in my chest again, that recognition of sound turned memory. The bell, the organ, the rain, everything returns in Oxford if one waits long enough. That evening I went to the pub on Walton Street, sat at my usual table near the window, the crossword folded beside my glass. 7 across. Enduring echo, 6 letters. I stared at it a long while before writing Risona. Stopped, then corrected myself. Risone. No, wrong still. I left it unfinished. Some clues, I thought, are meant to remain half-solved. When I left, the night had settled completely. The city lay washed clean under the lamplight, every gutter singing softly with rainwater. Somewhere, far off, the bells began again, hesitant, uncertain, human. And as I stood there listening, I realized I no longer knew whether they rang for the Canon, for Anna Fenton, or for me. Perhaps for all of us, each lost in our own variations of faith, guilt, and remembrance. I turned away, the sound following me down the darkened street, growing fainter with every step until it was nothing more than rhythm, the steady beating of a heart that refused to forget.